It's been a challenging week for Keir Starmer. Can he survive? I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics Podcast, and me, Frank McKenna, joined by Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock. And Joe and I sitting very comfortably, and we've enjoyed a weekend of football where Everton and West Ham have won once again. Liverpool got beat by Manchester City, so our producer Francesca's not too happy. And Jim, you've just told us Plymouth got the hammer by Lincoln City. So your weekend's probably been as disappointing as Keir Starmer's because, of course, the fallout from the Epstein files has continued to dominate the headlines this week, as we predicted last Monday. And yesterday afternoon, Morgan McSweeney, Keir Starmer's key advisor, has decided to resign, citing the fact that he was the guy who advised the Prime Minister to appoint Peter Mandelson to the job of United States Ambassador. Of course, what we didn't know last Monday was the scale of the relationship between Peter Mandelson and Jeffrey Epstein, and it turned out that it was shockingly bad and far closer than Mandelson had ever publicly admitted to. Nonetheless, journalists from the likes of the Financial Times have been pointing out that for many years now, they've been highlighting the fact that Mandelson did have close ties to Epstein and indeed to some very senior Russian operatives as well. So maybe that should have been enough to ring alarm bells in 10 Downing Street and prevent the appointment of Mandelson as the ambassador to the United States. The only thing I would say is that I'm getting a bit pissed off with the performative objections to Mandelson's appointment in hindsight, because I do recall that people were almost suggesting that this was a piece of political magic from Keir Starmer, the way in which he was placing Peter Mandelson in that position. It was clearly a political appointment, and it was done on the basis that he would be the type of personality who would be able to handle the lunatic that has been elected to the White House, Donald Trump. And from people like Michael Gove to a commentary in the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, they were all saying, what an interesting and clever move this is by the Prime Minister to appoint Peter Mandelson. And of course now, as the Epstein files reveal Mandelson to be the rogue that he was, all these same people are saying, oh, the Prime Minister's judgment was absolutely terrible. So that's been, for me, something that's been disappointing. You can criticise the decision. You can say, well, the Prime Minister should have got to know a bit more than he did before the appointment. But at least caveat that by saying, well, at the time, there were good reasons as to why Keir Starmer would see Peter Mandelson as an attractive proposition for that particular post. However, where we've got to now is that Keir Starmer is clinging on for dear life to his job as Prime Minister, and most of the commentators since Morgan McSweeney's resignation are suggesting that he is toast. Mr. Hancock, what do you think?
I don't think so immediately. Because we are coming up to the important by-election and the local elections, and anyone who makes this move is going to risk being accused of destabilizing the government. Now, obviously, the government's pretty listening already, I understand that. But there's another interesting reason, which has been discussed over the weekend, which is who is going to succeed. There is, in a sense, no obvious leader, and the 3 or 4 main contenders have all got reasons for there not to be an immediate election. I mean, Angela Rayner, whose momentum is clearly building, is still under investigation by HMRC over the property in Brighton. Wes Streeting is undoubtedly somewhat damaged because of his friendship with Mandelson. No suggestion of any impropriety on Wes's part, but nevertheless, you know, the Tory papers are publishing all the photographs they've got of Wes and Mandelson together. So it's probably not the best time for him. Andy Burnham, of course, isn't available. Then we come to the Home Secretary, Mahmood, but you know, the party seems to want to move to the left, so whether she'd be the right person. And so I just think that he's now appointed these 2 women as sort of interim appointments at Downing Street. And he will just be hoping that he can carry on. The caveat I have to put in, of course, is that when are we going to start getting our own dump of documents? They won't be quite on the scale of the Epstein file dumps, but there are going to be thousands of documents coming out in pursuance of this desire by Parliament that was prevailed last week against the government's wishes to keep things secret for security and international relations reasons. You know, if that starts to show Keir Starmer being given even more clear advice not to appoint Mandelson, then things could move fairly quickly. But just rather than saying, which my instinct was, frankly, that he would after Wednesday afternoon, where he was harpooned by Kemi Badenoch, and we may come on to that as well, that he might go the following morning. The fact that, you know, he's laid down a friend for his life, the old mantra in politics, and there's quite a lot of bitterness, by the way, in Number 10. There's some stuff coming out from friends of the former head of staff there, McSweeney, saying that it was ridiculous, cowardly, and you know, that the Prime Minister has laid down his friend for his life. That I just think, rather than jumping to the conclusion that he absolutely is toast now, I'm not talking about the longer term, but that he will stagger on. That's just my view for the reasons I've given.
I think the fact that there's no clear alternative candidate is saving him at the moment. And also who will want to take on the chin of by-election loss and big losses in the local elections. And again, Jim, you make the point, rightly so, that the 2 clear favourites at the moment, Angela Rayner and Wes Streeting, have their own difficulties and challenges to explain away. So it's not great timing for them, but you can't choose your timing when these opportunities arise. And the thing that I would be considering if I was one of those potential contenders is the fact that Keir Starmer, whatever we think of his performance as Prime Minister, and at most you would give it 6 out of 10, largely based on his performance on the international stage. We've said consistently for the last 18 months that the guy just doesn't seem to have any politics in him. He seems to have got into politics for the right reasons in terms of wanting to do the best by the country. But I can't imagine, Joe, somebody who isn't that political anyway, getting up this morning thinking, isn't this a great job? I just need to keep going and see how I can get through it. I would not be massively surprised if by the end of the day or this week, Starmer says, bugger you, I've had enough. You know, it's a horrendous job for somebody who is hugely political. It's a difficult task to be Prime Minister. But for somebody who is a public servant first and a politician second, I'm struggling to understand what the motivation continue would be.
Well, I think you've just answered it. It's that sense of public service. And, you know, we have often discussed on this podcast his many, many failings and his lack of political nous, antennae, or anything else, or curiosity. But the one thing that I think might keep him there is the fact that, as you say, Frank, on the international stage, he has done a good job. And it's very difficult to see either Wes Streeting or Angela Rayner or Andy Burnham having the same clout and the same relationship that straddles Europe and America with, you know, the maverick Trump who's in the White House. And I think that should be one reason alone for the Labour Party to go, hang on a minute, outside of Parliament, outside of Westminster and outside of the Labour Party, the world is in a terrible state, and what we need is stability. I mean, the idea that you would then have an internal election with all the backbiting that goes with that you would then probably have a general election, because, you know, Kemi Badenoch and probably the Lib Dems and Reform would say, well, you know, you weren't elected, go to the country. It's just not on, because for business, which has been hammered enough by this government and Brexit, you don't need uncertainty. For our relationship with Europe, when we're talking about defence and war overshadowing everything, you don't need uncertainty, and you don't need to add to the fragility. The one thing that I saw was quite interesting over the weekend was John Rentoul writing in The Independent, and he suggested that what Starmer could do is what Blair did in 2006, and basically say, you know, the next Labour conference will be my last one, after that I go. So you sort of set a timeline on it, that you're not hanging on, but you could phrase it along the lines that I've said, that, you know, for the sake of the country, in this febrile, fragile world atmosphere, I am staying here for the time being, but I am not going to stay on beyond X, Y, Z, which would allow people to think, all right, let's get behind somebody, because, you know, the country does not need yet another psychodrama. It's not even a psychodrama. It's not that interesting. It's bloody soap opera that becomes more and more implausible. The one thing that I think is so devastating from the Mandelson leaks, which of course, as far as I know, Starmer didn't know when he was appointed. And, you know, I absolutely get, if you're going to put somebody in the viper's nest, you need a snake. Well, who better than Mandelson? But the treachery that Mandelson displayed to Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling, two of the most decent men who've ever walked Westminster, at a time when they were trying to save the economy and bail out the Eurozone, that I think is absolutely despicable. And that, you know, it may come to the fact that actually Mandelson is worse than Kim Philby or John Profumo.
There's a lot to unpick there, Joe. And I think as far as Peter Mandelson's concerned, if all of those emails transpire to be as they appear to be, that Mandelson did what is being suggested, then there is no doubt that the guy will go to jail, right? That's the ultimate sanction, and that's where he'll end up if it's proven to be the case. But of course, he is denying any wrongdoing, and so we need to just reiterate that point as well. But let's just go through the points that you make there. I think the difference, of course, between Tony Blair and Keir Starmer, other than the fact that Tony Blair was a politician to his fingertips, is that the successor was obvious.
Yes.
Right now, Blair and some of the Blairites, well, not Blair actually, some of the people around him may have been trying to find an alternative candidate, but it was never likely. It was always going to be Gordon Brown as the next Prime Minister. Problem with Keir Starmer doing that, Joe, is that the race for the Labour leadership contest starts now, and you've got a very fractured parliamentary Labour Party. You've got, as Jim said, the most popular Labour politician in the country not able to stand in that contest as things are at this moment in time, unless somebody else falls on the sword and the National Executive Committee decide, well, actually, we will let Andy Burnham stand now, but that just makes the party look absolutely chaotic and daft, right? Because the cost of the election is the cost of the election. that hasn't changed. So how you could U-turn on that? Well, listen, this particular government and administration have been good at U-turns, but you see where I'm coming from. So I don't think it's as simple as Starmer saying, well, I'm just going to hang on until September. I don't think that's sustainable, I'm afraid. In terms of the alternative candidates, we've talked about the difficulties Angela Rayner, Wes Streeting have got. The guy whose name keeps popping up is Ed Miliband. And, I would not be a bit surprised to see some people on the soft left of the party saying we need some stability, we need somebody with experience, somebody who has had, in terms of those three candidates or anyone else you may care to mention, at least a semblance of experience within the top echelons of government. Now, Ed Miliband, for me, Jim, would be an absolute disaster, but I think he could be the dark horse as far as a successor to Starmer is concerned.
Yeah, I'm not convinced. I mean, it brings us to something. I mean, it's interesting. Can I just clarify? You don't think that Keir Starmer will be Prime Minister in September? Is that what you were saying, or have I misunderstood you?
No.
No. I'm asking Frank.
Oh.
I think.
I listen. Anybody who's trying to predict what's going to happen in politics now must be crackers, right? Because we do this every week. There's a different story. I think that the obstacles for Keir Starmer to remain as Prime Minister are huge at this moment in time. He's got a very key meeting with his Parliamentary Labour Party this evening. He may be able to convince some to stick with him. I don't know what the thoughts of some of the key cabinet members are. David Lammy certainly wasn't particularly supportive in his remarks about Mandelson's appointment. Pat McFadden, on the other hand, seems to be very robustly defending the Prime Minister. And my guess is Pat McFadden's got more influence over the Parliamentary Labour Party in the cabinet than David Lammy. Can he survive? If he survives beyond the local elections at this stage, I would suggest, Jim, that he's doing well. I think the other thing that we have to consider is that you've got the Epstein files continuing to publish emails, and we don't know what else is going to come out of those. And then we've got this, as you say, huge amount of material that's going to be released from the vetting process and the appointment of Mandelson itself. And it is difficult to believe that you will end up in a situation where there is nothing that people can hold up and say, well, why wasn't this a red flag for the Prime Minister?
I think once the local elections are over, that restraint on having a new leader disappears. During the summer is the appropriate time. And incidentally, not that it particularly matters, is this strange rule. I was looking up the rules for the electing of a leader. It says that, if in power, it takes place before the party conference. Now, technically, before the party conference starts on the day the party conference ends the previous year. But I think it's there to sort of suggest that you don't do it in the run up to local elections. I mean, if we're talking about, left field names that haven't been particularly discussed yet, you're throwing Ed Miliband into the thing. I'm not convinced. I'm not saying one picture defines a person, but the eating the
Jim,
sandwich.
I'm not convinced. I'm just saying.
No. Well, I just don't think.
Don't think about what's in your head. Think about a Parliamentary Labour Party that doesn't want to take a difficult decision, that appears to me to be far more soft left than Morgan McSweeney intended. That's for sure. Yeah. And appears to have no political nous as a body. We say that the Prime Minister's got no political nous. How much political nous has the Parliamentary Labour Party shown over the last 18 months? They've not been able to stick with fucking anything. So Ed Miliband is the soft option. That's what I'm saying, Jim. Not that I think it's a good. I think he'd be an awful pick.
That's a very interesting point you make, because McSweeney was regarded as all powerful and the architect of how the government was set up. Well, he didn't do a very good job of it with the PLP,
exactly.
which is there. So yeah, Ed Miliband would satisfy this strange desire, and I think it's going to be so misplaced. If the party swings to the left with the new prime minister and swings to the left, it'll be meat and drink to Farage. But let me just throw another name in, which is John Healey, the Defence Secretary. If we're looking for a safe pair of hands, I would just mention his name. Now, I don't know in detail what his politics are, because he's in a sort of hardline ministry and sort of generally plays the Union Jack card. So he's probably going to be too far to the right once again for this Parliamentary Labour Party. But that's just one thought about that.
Joe, going back to one of the other points that you made, that change of leadership will cause a clamour for a general election, because the new leader obviously won't have the mandate. We had these sort of conversations during the last government's tenure, didn't we? Because they changed their prime minister twice, didn't go to the country. I was listening to an interview this morning on Times Radio with Kevin Hollingray, the chairman of the Conservative Party. There is no way the Conservative Party are going to be calling for a general election, Joe.
No, I don't. I don't think they would want one any more than I think Reform would want one. Because neither of those parties are electable. And, even Farage in an interview with Laura Koonsberg last week in a documentary said we're not ready for government. The other name that I have seen touted around a few times is Al Carnes. Now, he was only elected in 2024, but he's a colonel. He's got Distinguished Service Order, OBE, Military Cross, former regular Royal Marines, Birmingham Selioak. Now, his name keeps cropping up as he's not tainted by the sort of, if you like, Miliband, Blair, Corbyn, all of that sort of stuff. I think I think Starmer is toast, but I don't think he's in the grill yet. And I think that if he realises that actually without Morgan McSweeney, he's freed up. One of the things that I've said in various interviews I've done over the last few days is that he's got a problem with women. He got rid of Sue Gray to make space for Morgan McSweeney. You could argue, why did he appoint Sue Gray in the first place? He got rid of Lucy Powell, who is now deputy leader of the Labour Party. He put Louise Hay into a position as a Secretary of State for Transport, even though he knew about her conviction, and then threw her under the bus. Angela Rayner was sort of sidelined. OK, the stamp duty and tax affairs are of her own making. And of course, there's Karen Pierce, who was Britain's ambassador to Washington, who was elbowed out of the way to make space for Peter Mandelson. And I just wonder whether, if you get rid of that sort of high testosterone, I'm in power, he's in power, you're not getting close to him, and you bring in some other people, some other voices, and some other women, if you listen to Emily Thornberry, if you listen to Harriet Harman, if you listen to Lucy Powell, if you listen to quite a lot of those people around. And the other appointment that he made, against advice, was his cabinet secretary, Chris Wormald, when there was a very highly qualified and well-respected, much more gutsy female civil servant in the running. And I just wonder, if you get rid of that sort of male toxicity in Downing Street by getting rid of McSweeney, you might actually end up listening to people.
Yeah. Just to point out that the Foreign Secretary and the Chancellor of the Exchequer are women.
Yes, and the Home Secretary.
Indeed.
Yes, I know, I know that, but
I think we can.
That's not advisors, Jim. That my point is, they are not advisors.
And there is a lot of anger. One's hearing the anger from women about this whole international, global thing around Epstein and Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. This entitlement of rich men to treat women abominably. That is really coming to the surface.
Yes. Absolutely. And it's this thing about listening. And it doesn't matter if you have got, you've got women in every big appointment of state. It doesn't matter if they don't have access to you, to talk to you, to say, hang on a minute, I think you might be making a mistake, or have you thought about doing it this way? And that's my point. It's that listening. And that goes back to the whole Epstein thing. And I would say, one of the things that I think will come out and is beginning to get traction is the relationship between Peter Mandelson and Palantir. That Palantir is run by Peter Thiel, who is a very close buddy of Trump. We have just signed walloping great billion-dollar contracts for the NHS and Ministry of Defence. And there are really big questions to be asked about that. And there are several people who are saying, you need to put a pause on this, because whilst we're all, navel gazing about Andrew and Mandelson, in America, many of the people who are mentioned in the Epstein files are still in business, they're still in power, and they've still got access to the White House, and they're walking around scot-free.
I think that the wider implications of the Epstein files are yet to be felt, because people are still going through this huge amount of documentation that was released from the Department of Justice. And of course, a Department of Justice that is managed and run by Donald Trump. And so not all of the documents have been released, and many of them have been redacted. So the president himself is able to sit there saying there is no smoking gun. Well, my guess is if there was a smoking gun, it's been well and truly buried. So I think you're right, Joe. There are going to be many wider issues that will be will emerge as the Epstein files continue to unfold. And I also think, the big story ultimately will be how close Epstein was to Russia, and how delighted President Putin will be with the fact that from beyond the grave, Epstein's influence is exactly delivering what he wanted, which is instability in one of the big Western powers. And that's happening in the UK, isn't it? It happened through Brexit. And again, within the Epstein files shows that Bannon, this very right-wing populist in America, has been advising Farage and other people in Europe on the right of politics. So all of that will unravel, Joe. And I'm not trying to dismiss the point that you make in terms of saying that will be the big story and should be the big story. But the fact of the matter is, the big story today is whether our Prime Minister will survive. And what the conversation we've had over the past 15, 20 minutes demonstrates is that he's not in a particularly strong position, but there is nobody from within the Labour Party itself, or indeed in the opposition parties, who we see as somebody who is naturally going to take over. And that in itself, Jim, if Keir Starmer, I repeat, decides that he can basically continue in the role and get some sort of motivation, satisfaction from that job, and as Joe said, it may be the public servant within him, it is possible still, even after election defeats in February and May, that he does hang on.
Well, if he could if the economy could start to pick up, I mean, that is in a sense the basis of everything. If by the summer the economy is picking up, then it maybe gives him a little bit of breathing space, because the narrative is not just on all this stuff that we've been talking about, but almost from day one, he misstepped. The scandal started, the winter fuel allowance. Right from day one, a grey cloud was starting to pun there, because Sue Gray was the next thing that came along almost from the beginning. And I was one who actually, after all the turmoil of Johnson and Truss, actually thought it was a strength, in a sense, the dullness of the man.
Yes, exactly.
The integrity there, and I actually welcomed that. But I'm now, unfortunately, sort of thinking it's this lack of direction is really disappointing. I mean, the fact that McSweeney yesterday, by the way, when he said he was leaving the government, as a friend of mine said, he wasn't aware that actually these spads and people were actually in the government.
It was a very strange use of language, Jim.
Except, of course, it was true. I mean, and this is the point. I advised Keir Starmer to appoint Peter Mandelson, i.e. the hapless Keir Starmer, who is just floating on the water and can be subject to every drift of the wind. You know, it was almost a criticism of Starmer in his resignation. So I think, you know, that he if the economy can pick up, things might look a bit different. But I tend to feel that by the summer, if Rayner's cleared her tax affairs, she'll be on manoeuvres. And as I think we said last week, the appetite for a woman leader, although I've got severe reservations about her ability to do the job, and I also am very wary of her politics, would be in quite a strong position. But you know, things happen.
I think you're right, Jim, and in a way, Keir Starmer's got to find the sort of the inner resilience, if you like, to say, I'm going to factor in the by-election and the local elections, but it's what happens after that, because as you say, you know, spring will come, it'll stop raining eventually if the economy begins to turn round, and of course there is no knowing what will happen internationally that then might put Starmer back in that position where, you know, the public, who are sick and tired of all of this, will go, I'll tell you what, I'd rather have him dealing with NATO and Trump than Farage or Kemi Badenoch.
It is the international stage that may save him in many people's eyes. What Starmer's supporters will say to you, and there are still some around, is close your eyes. And on the podium, there's Donald Trump, there's Mark Carney, there's Macron, and there's Andy Burnham, or there's Wes Streeting, or there's Angela Rayner, or there is Keir Starmer. And, you know, that is a strength that Starmer has, that international reputation that he's been able to carve out for himself. And nobody can deny that he's done a good job on the international stage, other than the key appointment he made to the ambassador's role in the United States. But as I said in my opening remarks, and of course it was a mistake to appoint Peter Mandelson, big criticism of Keir Starmer's premiership is he doesn't take enough risks. He's not being bold enough. Well, there you go. He probably went against his instincts in the appointment of Peter Mandelson, and it's blown up in his face. And he's probably thinking, I wish I'd have continued to be cautious and appointed the guy I wanted to appoint, which was apparently George Osborne.
Yeah, exactly. I just want to reinforce what you said about the lack of fuss a year ago, because it was quite instructive yesterday. Alex Burkhardt was on the channels for the Conservative Party and was challenged about the fact that the Conservative Party did not a year ago make a huge fuss about it. And Burkhardt had to rely on remarks made by Alicia Kearns, who is a rising star in the Labour Party, but she didn't speak for Kemi Badenoch. The fact of the matter is there was a great deal of consensus around Mandelson's trade expert can deal with the murky waters of the Trump court, and you know that it didn't create this great fuss that people, with some hindsight. Now, you know, we can all say that it was all because, you know, we didn't know about the rest of it, but there wasn't, and even in the press, there wasn't a massive sort of, you know, that Starmer was fighting widespread opinion and criticism in the papers to appoint this guy. There was quite a lot of, although there were the rumblings in the background, there was, I would venture to suggest, almost a national consensus that in extraordinary times Mandelson was the man for the job. And you know, we can't rewrite history. I think you made a very good point earlier on about that, Frank.
Yeah, and the performative nature of some of the criticism is what's really pissed me off. As I say, for people to say that the due diligence should have been firmer, that Keir Starmer should have been more curious, to use the great phrase that Joe often uses, to suggest that Jonathan Powell, perhaps, and he may be another name implicated in this appointment in the end, by the way, ought to have been flagging to Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, the dangers of appointing a guy who, let's face it, has fallen from grace on more than one occasion in his previous government of posts. So I think that all of those criticisms can be made now. But what you cannot say is that, well, at the time, we thought this was an appalling appointment because you knew, Prime Minister, that Peter Mandelson continued to have a relationship with Jeffrey Epstein after he'd been convicted of a crime. Well, everybody knew that. That was not new news, right? And the fact is that everybody in Parliament who follows these things, and every parliamentarian ought to follow those sorts of stories. So naivety and ignorance is no defence, my lord. The fact that they are now saying this is outrageous. Peter Mandelson had it. We all knew Peter Mandelson had a relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. And by the way, that is one of the reasons why Morgan McSweeney will have been saying to Keir Starmer, he's our man. Because he's been involved in that circle of gobshites who we're going to have to deal with in the White House for the next 4 years.
Yeah, you just wonder what these vetting documents, which are going to be revealed, will show. Because if it shows that, you know, amongst the vetters, the people who are doing the vetting, there was a really widespread, deep concern set against Morgan McSweeney and the political people who said we need to have Mandelson for political reasons. That is the danger for Starmer.
Yeah, for sure. And isn't it interesting that George Osborne was the other candidate?
Yeah. Well, and the other person whose name was touted around, which actually would have been the best thing Keir Starmer could have done, was Nigel Farage.
Nigel Farage.
Because if he'd appointed him, the Labour Party would have gone, how ridiculous, but he'd have neutralised reform at a stroke, and probably, you know, wouldn't have been any worse than Peter Mandelson.
Well, yeah, it's been the same though, Joe, because Nigel Farage's name appears on several occasions in these files as well. And so you'd have had the same sort of controversy, but it would have been easier for the Prime Minister, I'm sure, certainly the Labour Party, to manage. And let's finish this conversation with the fallout from the Mandelson scandal, because people are... Jim, I say this every week in jest, but you will remember the Profumo affair. I know an awful lot about it because it happened in the 60s, which is obviously I'm a 60s child.
Happened in the year of your birth, Sir Frank.
Yeah, it did.
You were a baby when it all happened.
And so I think this is far more scandalous than the Profumo affair, which did bring a government down. And the thing I just want to put to you both is, let's forget Keir Starmer. Peter Mandelson is attached to the Labour brand. He has been associated with the Labour Party since the 80s. He was an advisor to Neil Kinnock. He was an advisor not so much to John Smith, but certainly to Tony Blair. Gordon Brown, as Prime Minister, brought him back into government as Trade Minister. And now we find that not only was he the US ambassador, but he was also advising Keir Starmer on his last cabinet reshuffle, maybe on his first cabinet appointments as well. Could this be something that, as more and more details emerge of Mandelson's relationship with Epstein, just fatally wounds the Labour Party? It doesn't matter whether it's Wes Streeting, Angela Rayner, Ed Miliband, John Healey. Labour is finished, Jim.
Yes, just it's really interesting this, because Profumo has been referenced, and it was many generations ago. Just very briefly, John Profumo was the Defence Secretary. He had a relationship with a Christine Keeler, who was offered her services to people, let's put it like that, and she knew the Soviet naval attaché in London. So there was and Profumo originally went to the House of Commons and completely denied it, and then had to admit it, and there was therefore a betrayal similar in that sense, people lying, but there was also the security question. But you're absolutely right. But there were other things involved. Harold Macmillan, by this time, he'd said you'd never had it so good when he won the '59 election. Well, people weren't having it so good by 1963. And in the spring of 1963, a new leader of the Labour Party was elected following the death of Hugh Gaitskell, Harold Wilson. So there was an alternative and there were other dynamics. It wasn't as serious. I would actually say the MP's expenses scandal was, and there were parallels there with the point you're making, Frank, that these things taint a government. And, I can't actually think at the moment, it's a very depressing thing to say, that there's almost anything that the Labour government can do in the next 3 years that are going to reduce this episode to a footnote of history. It is going to be, unfortunately, the defining thing that this Labour government will be associated with, and that makes it very debilitating to put through the policies on a whole range of issues that we need to address. So I do think it's extremely serious, and of course will merely compound the feeling amongst people. We've had the Tory circus, we've now had the Labour circus. Let's roll the dice. And I know this is something that you want to talk about, Frank, and we don't like it, any of us on this panel. Let's roll the dice and try a complete alternative. Well, I'd say a complete alternative, replete with some of the people who are now associated with it. They were part of the mess, but nevertheless, that could be the feeling, and that's why I think you're absolutely right to say how serious this is.
Joe, Labour fatally wounded, do you think?
Well, I don't think so, because I think that, were the Tories fatally wounded by Boris Johnson? Yes, up to a point, but they were more wounded by the incompetence of Liz Truss and the shenanigans that went on and the collapse in the markets and everything else. But yes, I mean, Boris Johnson will always be associated with Partygate. I don't think the Tory party is particularly, although half the people that have now jumped ship to reform, of course, were knocking around at the time. And I think people have got shorter memories. They'll be shocked, but they won't be as scandalised as perhaps people were for Profumo or Kim Philby or Anthony Blunt when he was unveiled as the fifth man, the Russian spy. But I do think the worst thing is not having a roll of the dice for a party that none of us would particularly want to see anywhere near power, is that people go, oh, do you know what? They're all the same. I'm not going to bother. And that's the real danger. And somehow or other, every single MP, whatever party they are, they need to somehow or other restore trust and faith with the people that they represent, because what happens in Downing Street and Westminster isn't the same as what happens in Bootle or Basildon. It does have a huge effect, but that's how our media works. But my fear is that people will go, no, they're all rubbish, I'm not going to bother. And that, the way things are at the moment and the way things are being played on social media and manipulation. I mean, isn't it funny? Iran closes down its internet for 3 days and there's a sudden drop-off in posts about Scottish nationalism. Now, don't you find that a little bit weird to think that these bots were sending out these posts about the SNP? And I just think that, we actually, all of us, need to be really careful what we wish for, because you can't say they're all as bad as each other. And I don't for 1 minute believe that Keir Starmer is anything other than a decent bloke. I think he's ill-equipped to be a politician, but I think he's a decent man and an honourable man.
Okay. And on that note, we will close the first part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast. And the second part, I'm going to ask our two fabulous commentators, is Britain just ungovernable? It's a big question, and it's one we'll be getting into in part 2. So stick with us. We'll be back in a moment.
Hi, I'm Stephen Hesketh, CEO of Savvy Hotels, owner of the Hospitality Hero and co-owner of DivaFest. And I'm here today to share with you our great event that's coming up in collaboration with Downtown in Business, which is the Great Art of Hospitality Conference, happening on the 26th of February in Manchester City Centre at the Treehouse Hotel. This event will bring the creme de la creme of hospitality all in one room. We're looking at 200 individuals coming together to listen to the great operators in hospitality, but likewise some political big hitters to also question them on all things hospitality. We can't wait to see you there. Tickets will be on sale very, very soon via the website, and look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics podcast, where we are going to discuss in this second part of this week's episode the small question of whether the United Kingdom is just simply ungovernable in modern times. And Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock are here to give their expert opinion as to whether that is the case or not. Just some context for this. I remember well, 4th of July 2024, standing up at the City of Liverpool Business Awards, Palm House, fabulous venue that it is, Labour on its way to victory, and me saying to the business leaders in the room, well, what we do know is that this lot can't be any worse than the government that it is going to replace, because we'd had these psychodramas for many years. And it seems to me that since Brexit, at least, we've had a situation within the UK government where it's been impossible for any Prime Minister to get a grip on the agenda, to drive forward their vision, their policies. And whether it's simply Brexit, I don't think it is, but there are so many different pressures in modern politics now compared to even Tony Blair's day. And of course, the thing I'm referring to most is that issue that you referenced slightly, Joe, which is social media and bots and foreign influence in our politics. That's never been as advanced as it is nowadays. Then you get into the intrusion of personal lives of politicians. And so there's many people who I know who will be brilliant elected politicians who say to me, no thanks, not for a big clock, because it's a terrible job. Why would we bother putting ourselves through that? And so I do think that the calibre of our parliamentarians nowadays is not as high as it's been in the past. And then finally, I just think that you have an electorate who are desperate for the simple solution, the soundbite, the populist notion that we can just find more money on the money tree outside to sort out schools, education, the NHS, skills, training, jobs, all of those challenges that we face as a country. None of them, the main parties, Labour, Conservative, Reform, Lib Dems perhaps we can exclude from this particular comment, but nobody is really going out there saying, in order to have any chance of surviving this new geopolitical chaos that we find ourselves in, we're just going to have to get back into the European Union, or as close as to it as we can, and plug that £100 billion hole that we've put in our economy due to that terrible decision. So my answer to the question, is the UK ungovernable? At this moment in time, I'd say yes, because our politicians are following the lead of the public and not wishing to deal with the big questions, the big challenges, and be honest, they don't feel able to, Joe. They think that they've got to go along with this fantasy that the electors out there have, that if only we send people back to where they came from, if only we stop people scrounging benefits, if only we tax the rich even more than we do now, everything will be fine. No political leader that we have in this country at this moment appears to have the ability of doing the Margaret Thatcher thing, doing the Tony Blair thing, and having an honest conversation with the electorate and laying out their vision of what a future Britain might look like. Is it just impossible? Are we, as voters, too demanding? And does social media mean that it's impossible for governments to tread more lightly, as Keir Starmer promised before he was elected as Prime Minister?
Well, yes, and yes. I mean, I think social media is, poison, as many other people would agree. And there is no doubt that its interference and the way it shapes our political discourse is completely disproportionate to the number of actual people who are using it. I think we have become very selfish. I think we, as a public, expect everything right now. We're used to click and collect, next day delivery. Thank you very much. I want it. I can't be bothered to make a piece of toast, so I'll get some poor underpaid driver to deliver a piece of toast to me. I know that's extreme, but we have got into that thing. I think we're not helped either by the most awful media. I mean, Jim may or may not agree with me, but I think this is the worst quality of media that we've had in my lifetime since I've been doing politics. The Telegraph is no more than the Mail in broadsheet format now. The Mail is just a joke. The Sun and the Mirror don't really have any influence. So you've got a very, very hostile media, hostile to all politicians, but particularly to Keir Starmer and particularly to this Labour government, I think. And I think you've got this we move on so quickly. We, on the one hand, we don't have the either the attention span or the wit to work out that if you want to do this, it is going to require this. And the conversation needs to be about trade-offs. It's not about promises. And if somebody from whichever party could actually make the case, we all know, we say it to our kids, you do it when you're driving, you do it when you're shopping, you do it when you're booking a holiday, when you're choosing a menu, you are actually making a trade-off all the time. And if politicians could articulate that in a way that wasn't patronizing, they would actually find that they were connecting. I think the other problem is that with this intake of MPs giving Labour a huge majority, you've got people who are very, very inexperienced in anything. And that partly goes back to what you said, Frank, about the calibre of politicians. And that's at all levels. I mean, that's at local council and at Westminster and, in assemblies and things. But, when you look at what Andy Burnham's done in Manchester as mayor, when you look at what Andy Street and his successor have done in the West Midlands as mayor, you can really see where politics done properly and done locally actually makes a huge difference and people can feel it. And there is maybe an argument that, trying to govern the whole country without having greater devolution properly is impossible. And maybe that's the way that they need to go. But you've got to have a trade-off, and nobody's arguing those.
James, your thoughts on this small matter?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, people's expectations are very, very high. Health, pensions, things like the public realm, potholes. And my latest pet grievance is the disappearance of all road markings now. There is huge pressure on politicians to deliver on all these things, which didn't used to be the case. But our ability to pay for these things is hobbled by a number of things. Our lack of productivity. Now, that might be through laziness, actually. The loss of a sense of public service. I mean, the number of people I talk to now who try and interact with the government services and get really either AI bots or else really surly answers and a sort of acceptance that everything's going to take forever. The lack of certainty by parents about how to discipline their children. But I want to put this in the sort of historic context. I mean, Brexit absolutely is damaging us. 8% of our GDP per year is attributable to that. But of course, it goes back beyond that. I mean, let's just, it may be in the great cycle of history, that we were a country once that dominated the world and forced the Chinese to take opium because of our power and strength. Now, when the Prime Minister returns from a visit to China, pleading the case of Jimmy Lai, the response of the Chinese government is to put him in jail for 20 years. That shows our diminished role in the world. We've then got AI, which is, removing a large numbers of jobs. So, coming to the actual question, I mean, when you say ungovernable, it does conjure up serious concern about what you actually mean by that. Do you actually mean that there's going to be sort of social unrest? I think you're absolutely right, both of you, that we need the next government, or maybe this one, if it could happen. We need a clear plan which spells out the hard truths about what has to be done. I mean, this was classically avoided by, as we've repeatedly said on this podcast, when the incoming Labour government ruled out increasing, VAT, income tax, and national insurance. That sort of symbolised what you've said, Frank, the unwillingness of politicians to tell us the truth. So I think, and I hope it's not going to be Reform that has to do this, but maybe Kemi Badenoch will put it together, or Ed Davey, an honest plan, and say, and take the risk and say, this is what we have to do. This will be the rewards, and elect us on that basis. And there might be, because people are so fed up, rather than voting for extreme parties, they might actually vote for an honest centrist party that tells them the truth. Just one final thing, in all our despair, when something happens that plays to the hearts of the British people, children in need or whatever, this country is still extremely generous. There is something to work on in our, I don't want to sort of, overdo the doom, because at the heart of it, we are decent people and we do rise to the occasion. So that's my broad parameters on answering your question.
I think the point I'm making, Jim, isn't, which parties are being supported at the moment, who's up, who's down. Reform probably bobbling around 26% at this moment in time. It's an interesting couple of by-elections last week, one in Wales, which Reform surprisingly won, one in the south of England somewhere, I think it was, which Labour surprisingly held. So electorally, and who's polling where at this moment in time, isn't really the point of this question. The point of this question is, has the United Kingdom's structure and framework of governing actually passed its sell-by date? And I do think that, okay, you can have a plan, you can have a vision. Let's look at probably the most ambitious thing that this government wished to do, and that's planning reform. Now, we're 18 months into the government, and we're still not seeing any signs of that being delivered in an effective way. And the big resistors aren't necessarily the voters. It's often councils, and it's often Labour councils. So you've got an issue with the big thing that Labour wanted to deliver, 1.5 million homes. Not going to get anywhere near that total, right? And the last Conservative government, through Boris Johnson, attempted to deliver planning reforms because they recognised how lethargic our processes are, weren't able to get it through. Let's take another issue, assisted dying. Now, we have differences of opinion, but how can it be that the monolithic House of Lords can simply kick into the long grass a decision on that particular issue? This is an issue that people across the country have views on. The House of Lords, because of the way in which we are governed and our processes and bureaucracies work, will simply stop that from proceeding, even to the point of members of Parliament be able to vote that down or amend the legislation. So my view is that we need to have somebody or a political party that comes to the fore to say the structures are broken and we need root and branch reform. And that might be electoral reform, which is something many people now within the Labour Party are talking about. Andy Burnham is a big advocate for one. It may be if not scrapping of the House of Lords, certainly a significant reform of a chamber that is well past its sell-by date. And we're all talking about Peter Mandelson this week, but you could go through that place with a dose of salts and find more than a dozen who shouldn't be sat on those red benches anymore. Michelle Moan's name is the obvious one, but there'll be others. And apparently the Prime Minister is about to bring forward legislation that will be a catch-all and will get rid of people who've been caught up in scandals, big and small, who are currently lords, and they'll be kicked out, and rightly so. But that needs drastic and radical reform. But the big point, and I think you've made it, Joe, devolution. Surely this is where we need to go now. Surely we need to have a situation where not this tinkering at the edges, and let's give them a couple of powers here, and let's give them a few bob for this. Let's have a genuine devolved power into assemblies for the north, assemblies for the southeast, for the southwest, for the east and west Midlands. Let's go for gold, because we are not, at this moment in time, and I don't see any for the foreseeable future, hope for us to get to grips with the big challenges our country has without good devolved government, which may then start to attract people who think, do you know what, for my local region, for my local people, and with the real powers and levers to start to deliver things in the way Andy Burnham, Bev Craig, Richard Leese before them, Bernstein, others in that Manchester region have proved can be done. That is, for me, the big vision. Devolution, but genuine devolution, Jim. Not this tinker around at the edges and giving people crumbs off the table.
Yeah, well, this is my favourite subject, and I say it once again. We had it all these arguments are being enunciated by John Prescott at the turn of the century when he wanted to set up the regions of England, and we know how it ended. But I do think that is the answer. This is going to get awfully dry, and a lot of people are going to say to this conversation, Frank, that the issues are so huge. Why on earth are you talking about this dry and boring issue of structural reform? But it isn't, actually, if it was done properly. So just bear with me for a second. I mean, my preferred way of doing it was the regions, because I think they had the space and the heft in the northeast, in the northwest. There were issues about boundaries and this, what is the southeast of England, and Joe will be better able to address that. That was a particular problem, and whether Devon and Cornwall and southwest, and but those are relative details. And I thought that was the structure. What we have to face, Frank, is that, and to be fair to the government, they are going through a process of devolution, because most of the country is due to, and this is why these elections are being cancelled, within the next year or two, have these combined authorities. And, I suppose we would be challenged as a regionalist, why don't you give this a chance? But at the heart of it is what you say. Is the Treasury prepared to seriously devolve resources to devolved structures? And that has always been the thing that's held things up. And, it's complicated because the government, in another context, are going in the opposite direction with the police. Yeah. People want local bobbies and all that sort of thing, and there are arguments in favour of it. But the Mahmood wants to go in the opposite direction and reduce the number of police authorities. So this is a very dry and dusty subject. But you and I know, Frank, and perhaps Joe Dillon will hear what Joe's got to say. I do think this is absolutely crucial to the future government of England.
But I think when we're asking the question, is the UK ungovernable? We can either say, well, no, it's just because we've had a useless load of prats in as prime ministers and cabinet members for the last, decade almost? Or we can actually say, look at the framework and the infrastructure in which they're working, and actually it's really difficult and challenging to challenge it. I would say that the one thing you're not going to be able to sell to the great British public at this moment in time, and probably never have been able to, is that we need more politicians. So alongside the devolution model, we've got to find a way of slimming down, Joe, Parliament, as I say, the House of Lords, and I would say far too many councillors as
Oh,
well,
yeah.
I'm afraid.
Sorry, can
Well,
I just
but I-
just before you come in, I meant to say this, and tied in with what that vision is, Frank, is reform of the House of Lords, and I would say 70% of the House of Lords to be represented from the regions of England, which would do away with this southeast bias in the
Yeah.
peerage. They're all from the southeast. 70% from the regions. 20% reserved for experts, you know, people experts in AI or surgery or military matters or whatever, and then you'd probably have 10% as prime ministerial patronage. Sorry, that was a crucial part of my architecture. Sorry, Joe.
Well, I just think if you have better devolution, and you see that the thing is, the government's got a plan, but it's allowed that plan to be hijacked by, oh, this is an assault on democracy.
Exactly.
And this is where they stop fighting
Yeah.
back. And this is where they've got it so wrong. So, you know, Morgan McSweeney might have been a genius, but he was bloody awful at comms. You know, Matthew Doyle's now in the Lords, and he wasn't particularly good, even though he'd learned his trade during the Blair years. But, you know, if you allow something that you really care about to be hijacked and you aren't prepared to go, no, you don't understand, let me tell you, and keep saying it, then you've lost the argument to start with. And I think the thing about devolution is that it would make people see an impact in their local area. Because at the moment, you know, you've got councils who are absolutely strapped for cash and that they can just about keep their heads above water. I mean, particularly above water if they're in parts of flooded England. But you've got, you know, the water authorities, you've got all of those other things. But we've got stuff that is being done. You know, the railways are coming back into public ownership. Great British Energy. There are lots of things going on, but the government is not telling people, and people can't see because we're also blinkered and can only concentrate for 30 seconds, what that might mean. That, you know, actually, if you saw derelict buildings being turned into social housing, if you saw town centres being transformed so that there was housing over the top of shops, and therefore shops would open again because there'd be people to serve, you would actually begin for people to feel better, and you would have that connection with local councillors, and that would mean, yes, you could certainly get rid of an awful lot of constituency MPs and absolutely cut the House of Lords to the bone.
The architecture needs to be sorted out, whether or not we have any political leader, political party who's the appetite for that. But I am encouraged by things such as Andy Street and Ruth Davidson's establishment of a think tank to perhaps start to look at these. And there's two people who've both been leaders within devolved government.
Yes.
Scotland and the West Midlands.
But are you content, Frank, for now to allow the rollout of combined authorities and see if they are the answer? Or have you got doubts
Jim,
about it?
I've got huge reservations because the government has, as Joe said, allowed itself to be blown off course by NIMBYism. You basically got local councillors who are they're not turkeys voting for Christmas here, are they? The turkeys actually running in the other direction saying, no, thanks. Lancashire councillors are not wanting local government reform because there's going to be less of them. Now, if we were blessed with genius councillors across the country who were able to deliver the things that people in their wards wanted them to, well, we'd all be saying, well, what we need is more of these people. But they're low calibre. They're often people who are serving on councils because nobody would pay them that sort of money as they get as allowances on councils. And I can't find the word without insulting people that I know very well. There are some good councillors, but most of them are shite. And so for me, the government have allowed itself, as Joe said, to be deflected from what was a decent plan, which was combined authorities, devolved, local government reorganisation that reduced the number of ward councillors. It's not going to get there within this Parliament, Jim.
You don't think Lancashire? I thought Lancashire was definitely going to get a combined authority with the abolition of the the 13 district councils
But
within
it's
the
not
next
going,
year or two.
But what they're doing, Jim, and I think this will, the less authority the administration in Westminster has, the easier it's going to be for Lancashire authorities to drag this debate on. So what they've agreed to at the moment is to establish a shadow combined authority, and they are starting to appoint people to particular jobs. What they have not done is committed themselves to a mayor. In Cheshire, they have committed themselves to a mayor. And elsewhere in the country, you've got a hodgepodge. So you've got this rollout that looks very uneven, and therefore you are going to have people in Lancashire, for example, saying, "Well, we haven't got a champion. People in Cheshire have," and this is the lack of confidence that this government has in simply going to the country and saying, "You're going to have a mayor, whether you like it or you don't." And that comes back to that point earlier that we've said: no vision, no plan, no real conviction of the sort of things. It's a government that seems to be happy to negotiate its way through the day-to-day machinations of government. But it is
interesting. It is interesting that Prescott has faced, from the all-powerful Tony Blair. Even he wasn't prepared. Prescott's vision for regional government could have, if Blair had said, "This is what we're going to do," and never mind all these, councillors and their opinions. We're the government of the country. Even he didn't have the heft to actually do what you and I know needs to be done.
And the other thing, I mean, one of the other people, I think I mentioned it in the first part of the programme, is, the person who Keir Starmer appointed as Cabinet Secretary, Chris Wormald, who's very much regarded as not a particularly safe pair of hands, but nobody who's actually going to get anything particularly done. That apparently was the recommendation supported by Morgan McSweeney, presumably because Mr. Wormald would have been less of a threat to his power base. And actually, the argument was for a woman who'd got a lot of oomph, and now we hear that, Louise Casey's name is in the frame. Well, she can sort out an awful lot of things, but whether she can do this one, who knows, whether she's got the Midas touch to save Keir Starmer.
Again, I would suggest that one of the big problems, the architecture of British politics, is the power of civil servants. And maybe that is an issue that needs to be addressed as well. And Jim has said, the Treasury, they're the biggest blockers of progress in this country on a whole range of things. We have seen an awful lot of accuracy in those old episodes of Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister. Jim, final word.
Sure. I was just saying that I think people like Wes Streeting have expressed their dismay at having got the levers of power, seeing how, I'm going to use Gove's term, the blob, but there have been expressions of frustration in some ministers and some determination to do something about it. But again, everything that we've been discussing today undermines their ability to do it at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, we've gone way over the hour of conversation today, I guess. So I do apologise to our viewers and listeners. Spread the episodes out over a couple of days. You don't have to listen to it all at once, do you? We'll be back next Monday. Who knows what will have happened in the next 7 days? Will Keir Starmer still be Prime Minister? Will Plymouth Argyle win a game? We'll find all that out and more, I'm sure. Thanks for listening again. Enjoy your week, and we'll be back in the den next Monday. Thanks for now.